Yuji says, "I don't have any compassion, I'm a cog." And if you've ever blamed yourself for things that were never fully in your control, then you know the pain of feeling like everything is your fault. That's why Yuji's suffering feels so relatable. We watch someone full of life slowly start to believe that his very existence is the problem. I'm Alex, and I want to use Yuji Itadori as a mirror for what happens when we blame ourselves for things that were never fully in our control. How shame can turn into self-hatred, and what may exist underneath that shame in the first place. So the first thing that Yuji shows us is what happens when you start to believe that the problems in the world are because of you. Yuji starts off as someone kind, compassionate, and emotionally open. Even after being sentenced to death, he still approached life lightheartedly. But after witnessing so much loss and suffering around him, he begins to blame himself when these things were never fully in his control. Not only was Yuji not able to save his friends, he had his body taken away from him. He lost all sense of control, and all he could do was watch. And I think this is where self-blame can become so painful. When everything feels out of control, blaming yourself can feel like something to hold on to. Because if it was my fault, then maybe it could have been prevented. Maybe if I had done more, or I knew better, things would have turned out differently. So we think, maybe if I caused this, I can stop this from happening again. And sometimes we replay the past with knowledge that we didn't have at the time. We may think to ourselves, I should have known better. The signs were right in front of me. If only I was paying attention, things would have been different. But that's like working back from a problem that's already been solved. This is something that I've struggled with myself. I remember seeing a local band years ago, and they had just released their first album. I brought the record with me for them to sign. And the lead vocalist, he seemed like such a genuine, chill, laid-back kind of guy. A few days later, I found out that he took his own life. And afterward, when I listened back to the music, the signs couldn't be more obvious. They were in front of me the entire time, and I feel like I was just too stupid to notice. And I keep playing back in my head, if only I said something, maybe he'd still be here. Which sounds irrational, because it's not like I knew him personally. I felt responsible. I blame myself for something that had nothing to do with me. And while logically I knew it wasn't my fault, I eventually realized I was using rational thinking to avoid having to fully feel my emotional pain. And over time, guilt can slowly become shame. Instead of thinking, I made a mistake, I think, I am the mistake. And a question you may ask is, when something bad happens around me, what do I start believing about myself? And this is the second thing that Yuji shows us. What can happen when we hold on to pain for so long that it starts becoming who we are? At first, guilt might feel like something that we carry, but over time, it can start to feel like it's a part of us. And I think this is what happens to Yuji. Instead of seeing painful experiences as things that happen around him, he begins treating them as proof about who he is. And the more we repeat thoughts like, I hurt people, or I'm the problem, the more we believe it. Not because they're true, but because we repeat them so many times, they become familiar. This is why Yuji's cog mentality feels so relatable. He stops seeing himself as a person and starts measuring his worth based on whether he can still be useful. To him, he's a cog, and cogs have function. And sometimes self-punishment can start to feel comforting, because if we punish ourselves enough, then maybe it feels like we're taking responsibility. If I suffer enough, then maybe I can make up for what happened. And once shame becomes part of how we see ourselves, then everything feels like proof that we're the problem. There are moments in my life where I felt abandoned or betrayed, and instead of seeing those experiences for what they were, I treated it as evidence that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I thought that if I was lovable, this wouldn't have happened to me. And sometimes when shame becomes familiar, we may isolate, push others away, or self-sabotage, which just leads to more self-punishment, shame, and hatred. And for a long time, I was stuck in this cycle of self-sabotage because it felt like that's all I had. And this becomes harder if we learn that love had to be earned. If people only love me for what I do instead of for who I am, then what does that say about me? So when something goes wrong around us, we don't just think that something painful happened. We think that this happened because I'm the cause of it. And over time, shame can lead to emotional numbness. Yuji doesn't stop experiencing life. He starts treating it as something to survive. And I think a lot of people experience something similar. I kept telling myself, it's not my fault, over and over again. But I was saying this rationally, without ever fully acknowledging what I was emotionally carrying underneath it. And those feelings of guilt and shame stay with me for years. Because sometimes it's easier to say that I'm a horrible person than to say that I'm hurting. For a long time, I'd rather hate myself than be vulnerable. And this leads us into the final point that Yuji shows us. Sometimes shame is not the deepest feeling. Sometimes it's protecting us from something that we just weren't ready to face. I convinced myself that I was directly addressing my shame, all the while I was emotionally speed bumping. I was managing the pain just to keep going, without ever fully feeling what was underneath it. And I think we can see something similar in Yuji. After everything that happened in Shibuya, Yuji disconnects from his emotions, because the guilt and helplessness he felt was too much to bear. And it makes sense that he adapted this way. Sometimes we survive painful experiences in the only ways we know how. The problem is that Yuji starts living from that adaptation. He doesn't value himself, he hates himself. He doesn't see himself as someone who needs support. He sees himself as something that only exists to endure. Because sometimes self-hatred can become a form of self-preservation. As painful as it is, our mind may learn to survive by staying guarded, emotionally numb, or hypercritical. Enduring pain can feel safer than truly feeling it. And if you relate to this, I don't think that means that there's something wrong with you. Maybe part of you adapted before you had the support or space to feel everything. Whether the feeling under the shame is guilt, loneliness, hopelessness, or feeling unlovable, I don't think we're meant to carry these feelings completely alone. This is why Yuji needs support from his friends. Not because someone can wave a magic wand and erase his pain, but because healing becomes so much harder when we isolate ourselves inside of it. Sometimes another person can create that kind of space, where you feel like you no longer have to hide those parts of yourself. But it's also important to reconnect with parts of you that are not constantly relating to your sense of shame. Maybe that's music, art, exercise, or anime. What is one moment, however brief, where you can simply exist without punishing yourself? Maybe it's less about running away from pain and creating your own space for growth. Because sometimes we're not actually dealing with the pain. We're just punishing ourselves for having it. So the question isn't, how do I stop myself from feeling shame? Maybe the question is, what feeling might be underneath the shame? And if your mind avoids the question, you don't have to force an answer. You might simply notice, maybe my mind is trying to protect me from something right now. It's not about forcing yourself to confront everything all at once. It's about becoming a little more aware of what's already there. And awareness gives you a little more space between that feeling and what you do with it. If you begin noticing these patterns of shame and self-hatred, it can help you to notice the thoughts, patterns, and behaviors that keep reinforcing them. So a question you could ask yourself is, what is one small thing you can change about your environment, routine, or relationships that would help this cycle play out just a little less? We can see this happening in Yuji. One moment he's lighthearted and outgoing, and then something reminds him of the guilt that he carries, and we watch that familiar cycle of shame replay inside him again. And I think many of us may experience something similar. So I invite you to ask yourself, if Yuji had gone through the same mistakes you have, would you see Yuji the same way you see yourself? Inspired by his granddad, Yuji was driven by the intrinsic value of life, but when he lost sight of his own, he needed others to see it for him. And sometimes it's easier to hate ourselves than to admit that we're hurting. So my question is, what would happen if you were able to acknowledge the pain without turning yourself into a villain? And what would it mean, not logically, but emotionally, if it wasn't entirely your fault? Because maybe healing begins when we stop turning pain into proof that we're the problem. Because you are not a problem, and you never were. If this video connected with you, maybe take a moment and give yourself space to breathe. You deserve it. And if you'd like to see more, then click this video here, where I talk about why attention feels like love when we're lonely.